Let's write each of these fractions as a percent. To write a fraction as a percent, let's start by looking at a percent. Let's take 9%. Well, we can rewrite 9%. 9% can be rewritten as the fraction 9 over 100. 9% is the same as 9 over 100. Here, we take the value of our percent and write it in the numerator of our fraction, and put that over 100. So that means if we want to change a fraction into a percent, one of the ways we could do that is to write our fraction as something over 100. But let's look at the three fractions we've been given. If we look at our three fractions, we can see that none of them have a denominator of 100. That means that we need to take each of these three fractions and write them as equivalent fractions. Remember, equivalent fractions are fractions that have the same value, but they just look a little different. Here, each of the equivalent fractions needs to have a denominator of 100. So, since we want a denominator of 100, we need to take that number, 100, and divide it by the denominator that we currently have. So we know what we need to multiply by in order to make a denominator of 100. So let's start by looking at the fraction 3/4. We want to take the denominator of 100, the denominator that we want. We want to take that number and divide it by our current denominator, 4. So we take 100 divided by 4, and we get 25. That means that in order to change this denominator from a 4 to a 100, we need to multiply it by 25. Great! Now let's find these values for each of our other fractions. Next, we'll look at 1/5. So we take the number that we want in the denominator, 100, and divide it by our current denominator of 5. 100 divided by 5 is 20. So in this fraction, we would need to take our denominator and multiply it by 20 in order for us to get a denominator of 100. Last, let's look at the fraction 7 over 20. Here again, we take 100 divided by our current denominator of 20, and we get 5. So in this fraction, we would need to multiply the denominator by 5 in order to get a denominator of 100. Great! But remember, we can't just take each of these numbers and multiply the denominator of each of our fractions by them. We need to consider the numerator of these fractions as well. So in step number 2, we need to create those equivalent fractions. Remember, if we multiply the denominator of a fraction by a number, we need to multiply the numerator of that fraction by the same number as well, in order to create an equivalent fraction. So let's look again at 3/4. We want to change 3/4 into an equivalent fraction, one that has a denominator of 100. Well, we know if we take 4 times 25, we'll get 100. But if we multiply by 25 in the denominator, we also need to multiply by 25 in the numerator. That would be the same as multiplying by the fraction 25 over 25. And if we look, 25 over 25 reduces to 1. It's just a fancy form of 1. So here, we're taking 3/4 and multiplying it by a fancy form of 1. When we do, in the numerator, 3 times 25 is 75. And in the denominator, 4 times 25 is 100. So, 3/4 is equivalent to 75 over 100. Great! We've just written our first fraction as something over 100. Let's repeat this process for the other fractions. Again, we look at 1/5. In order to have 1/5 have a denominator of 100, we need to multiply it by the fancy form of 1, 20 over 20, since that's the value that we found in step 1. 20 over 20 reduces to 1, so we're just multiplying by 1. In the numerator, 1 times 20 is 20. And in the denominator, 5 times 20 is 100. So we get 20 over 100. Finally, we look at 7 over 20. Here we multiply by the fancy form of 1, 5 over 5, the value that we found in step 1. Taking 7 times 5 in the numerator, we get 35. And 20 times 5 in the denominator is 100. So we get 35 over 100. Hey! We've just written each of our original fractions as an equivalent fraction, written as something over 100. We can now take these fractions and convert them to percents. So in step number 3, to convert these fractions to percents, look back at our original example. 9% is the same as 9 over 100. We need to take the value of the numerator and just write a percent after it. So here, taking 75 over 100, that's the same as 75%. Just taking the numerator of this fraction and writing a percent symbol after it. Here, 20 over 100 is 20%. And here, 35 over 100 is 35%. And now we've written each of these fractions as a percent. 3/4 is the same as 75%. 1/5 is the same as 20%. And 7 over 20 is the same as 35%.